My name is Desmond Price, and on a Friday morning in June, I did something that I had been thinking about for 8 months. 8 months of finding my garage occupied, 8 months of polite conversations that produced zero results, 8 months of HOA complaints that went nowhere because the person I was complaining about was the person who ran the HOA. I walked into my garage at 7 in the morning, confirmed that Linda Forsyth's champagne-colored Lexus was parked exactly where it had been parked every Tuesday and Friday for the preceding 8 months. Right there, in my two-car garage, on my private property, as casually as if she had paid for the space. And I did two things in sequence that I had planned with the particular care of a man who has spent 30 years as an architect and who does not build anything without a complete set of drawings. First, I called a contractor I had hired the week before and told him to start. And second, I booked a flight to Japan. The contractor sealed my garage, solid, professionally, with a brick and mortar infill wall across the entire garage opening that matched the existing exterior facade so precisely that by the time I landed in Tokyo 14 hours later, there was no longer a garage at 24 Crestline Court. There was a wall, a beautiful, perfectly finished wall, and Linda Forsyth's Lexus was on the other side of it. And what happened over the next 4 days, what the HOA did, what the city inspector said, what Linda's husband said when he found out, and what the Crestline Park Neighborhood Council voted on 11 days after I left, is a story about what happens when you stop arguing with someone who won't listen and start building things instead. Stay with me. I want to tell you about the garage before I tell you anything else, because the garage is the beginning of everything, and because understanding what it was and what it meant will help you understand why what happened to it mattered the way it did. I am 58 years old. I am a licensed architect with 30 years of practice, the last 18 of which have been my own firm, Price Architecture, based in Portland, Oregon, with a secondary office in Denver, where I spend roughly 4 months of the year working on projects in the Mountain States. I mention the architecture because it is, as you will see, deeply relevant to every decision I made and every action I took in the events I am about to describe. My house at 24 Crestline Court in the Crestline Park neighborhood of Portland is a 1928 craftsman bungalow that I purchased in 2009 and have spent 14 years carefully and meticulously restoring. The restoration has been, in every sense that matters, a labor of love, not because I needed the house to be perfect, but because the house deserved it. A 1928 craftsman bungalow that has survived nearly a century is a building that has proven its right to continue existing. And when you are the current steward of such a building, you have an obligation to understand what it is and to make decisions that honor that. The house has approximately 2,000 square feet of living space, original fir floors throughout, period-appropriate craftsman woodwork in every room, a front porch with the tapered columns and exposed rafter tails that are the defining aesthetic elements of the style. And this is relevant: a detached two-car garage at the rear of the property, accessed from the alley that runs behind Crestline Court. The garage is a period structure built in 1931 according to the city permit records I researched when I bought the house. It is not original to the main house, but is historically consistent with it. The same craftsman-influenced design vocabulary, the same materials palette, the same proportions. It is, in architectural terms, a contributing structure to what the city has designated as the Crestline Park Historic District, which means it is protected under the same historic preservation guidelines that apply to the house itself. You cannot demolish it. You cannot substantially alter its appearance without Historic Review Board approval. It is, in every practical and legal sense, a permanently protected part of the property. Inside the garage, my vehicles, a truck I use for site visits, and a smaller car for daily use, and significantly my drawing studio. I converted the rear section of the garage into a working studio about 6 years ago, a dedicated drafting and design space with a large work table, plan storage, the kind of bright north-facing light that architects need and treasure. The studio is where I do my best work. It is where I have designed buildings that have been built in 8 states. It is, in a sense that I find difficult to overstate, the most productive and meaningful physical space in my professional life. Linda Forsyth had been parking her Lexus in my garage for 8 months. In my studio, in the space I used to draft buildings, between my drafting table and the garage door. I want you to understand that before we go any further. Crestline Park is a historic neighborhood in northeast Portland, established in the 1920s, listed on the National Register of Historic Places at the district level, the kind of neighborhood that architecture students visit on field trips and that preservationists hold up as an example of what urban residential design looked like when it was done with craft and intention. The streets are lined with Douglas fir trees that have been there for 80 years. The houses are almost uniformly craftsman bungalows and foursquares, with a few colonial revivals mixed in, all within the appropriate period range for the district. It is, by any measure, a beautiful neighborhood. It is also, as beautiful historic neighborhoods in desirable cities often are, a neighborhood with strong opinions about itself. The Crestline Park HOA is one of the more active in Portland. It manages the historic district's community review process, organizes seasonal events, maintains the street tree program, and runs a newsletter that appears monthly and that a significant portion of residents actually read, which is more than you can say for most HOA publications. Linda Forsyth had been HOA president for 4 years when the garage situation began. She was 62, recently retired from a career in hospital administration that had equipped her with a comprehensive toolkit of organizational and institutional management skills, and a tendency to apply those skills to whatever context she found herself in, regardless of scale. She was the kind of person who brought written agendas to informal neighborhood gatherings and who maintained a personal calendar that scheduled her week in 30-minute increments. She was not a bad person, in my assessment. She was a capable and organized person whose capabilities had been, in the context of a residential HOA, inadequately matched to situations that required restraint rather than management. She lived at 22 Crestline Court, directly next door to me on the north side. Her house was a 1924 Craftsman foursquare, in excellent condition, with a narrow side yard between our properties that had always been a source of friction in the neighborhood, because the alley access for both properties ran along a shared section that served both houses before splitting to serve the individual garages. Her own garage was a one-car structure that was, frankly, too small for a modern vehicle. The Lexus she drove was a full-sized luxury SUV that fit in her garage only if she folded the mirrors and pulled in with precise care, and even then she said it was too tight and worried about door dings. I know this because she told me, in the initial conversation, the one where she explained why she had been parking in my garage, she said her garage was too small for her car and that mine had the space. She said it the same way Renata Voss had told Marcus Teller that her car got hot in the sun, as a fact that explained a situation rather than as a request for permission, as if the gap between her need and my resource was a problem that the resource was simply going to solve. The garage at 24 Crestline Court has 2 access points, the main double door facing the alley, which is the standard vehicle entry and exit, and a pedestrian door on the south side that I use to access the studio without disturbing the vehicle bays. I typically leave the main doors closed but unlocked during the day because I go in and out of the studio frequently and operating the garage doors constantly is inconvenient. The first time I found Linda's Lexus in my garage was a Tuesday morning in October. I came out through the pedestrian door to get something from my truck and found a champagne-colored Lexus SUV parked in the second bay, the bay I kept open for the studio access path. My truck was in the first bay, undisturbed. The Lexus was just there, as if it had always been there, neatly parked and occupying exactly the second bay. I stood and looked at it for a moment. Then I walked to Linda's house and knocked on her door. She answered promptly. She was dressed for something, not outdoor clothes, but the kind of put-together daytime attire of someone with morning plans. I said, "Linda, there's a car in my garage that I think is yours." She said, "Yes, I put it there this morning. My garage is too tight and I scraped the mirror last week. I hope that's all right." She said, "I hope that's all right," past tense on the action, present tense on the permission. The permission request was retroactive and I suspected not entirely genuine. I said it's not all right, actually. The garage is part of my property and I use the second bay for studio access. I need you to move it. She said she understood and would move it that afternoon. I said I needed her to move it now, please, because I needed the second bay. She moved it. She was pleasant about it. She said she appreciated my understanding. I said I hadn't expressed understanding. I had asked her to move her car, but I said it quietly and then went back to work. The following Friday, the Lexus was back. I want to be precise about the pattern, because the pattern is what established the foundation for everything that followed. For the first 4 months, October through January, Linda parked in my garage twice a week, every Tuesday and Friday, with the regularity of someone who has a schedule. She was not secretive about it. She did not hide the car or try to disguise her presence. She simply parked there as if the twice-weekly arrangement were a fact of life that had been agreed upon, and she retrieved the car when she had finished whatever she had done that morning. I spoke to her about it 5 times during those 4 months. Each conversation followed the same arc. I said the garage was my private property and I needed her to stop parking in it. She said she understood. She said she would make other arrangements. She said she was sorry for the inconvenience. And then she parked there again on the following Tuesday or Friday. After the 3rd conversation, I documented everything: date, time of arrival, time of departure, whether she had been notified. I photographed the car in my garage on multiple occasions. I photographed the interior of the garage, showing the car's position relative to my studio equipment. I kept the documentation in a folder that grew steadily over the 4 months. After the 5th conversation, in January, I decided the neighbor-to-neighbor route was producing nothing and that I needed to escalate. I submitted a formal complaint to the Crestline Park HOA. Here is where the particular problem of the situation became structurally obvious. The complaint went to the HOA. The HOA president was Linda Forsyth. The complaint, in other words, went to the person I was complaining about. I received a letter from the HOA, signed by Linda in her capacity as president, acknowledging receipt of my complaint and informing me that the matter had been reviewed and that the board had found no violation of community standards, as the parking in question was on private property and the HOA's enforcement authority extended to common areas and street-facing elements, not interior private space arrangements between neighbors. She had reviewed her own conduct and found no violation. I called an attorney. My attorney was a woman named Catherine Park, a property attorney in Portland who had done some work for me on a historic preservation question some years earlier, and who I trusted for exactly the reason that Barbara Wick was trusted in June Rawlings's story. She understood both the law and the specific context of the kind of property I owned. She knew historic district regulations. She knew Portland property law. She was direct and thorough and did not waste time. I met with Catherine in February, 4 months into the situation, and laid out the documentation. She looked at it carefully and told me what I had suspected but wanted confirmed. The legal situation was, in its basics, clear. Linda Forsyth was parking on my private property without my permission. This was straightforward trespass, civil trespass of her vehicle onto my real property. I could seek an injunction. I could seek civil damages for the inconvenience and any demonstrable harm. The legal path was available and would likely succeed. The structural problem, Catherine said, was not the law. It was the enforcement reality. Getting an injunction would take months. Enforcing the injunction, if Linda chose to continue parking, people do sometimes continue behaviors even after injunctions, would require returning to court. The process was slow and expensive and imperfect in the way that all injunction-based relief in private property matters is imperfect. She said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Desmond, you're an architect. You think in terms of physical solutions to spatial problems. What would a physical solution look like here that didn't involve the court system?" I said I had been thinking about that. She said, "What are you thinking?" I told her. She listened, She asked several precise questions about Portland building code, the historic district review process, and the specific technical approach. I had already researched all three because I am an architect and I research before I speak. When I finished, she said, with the careful tone of someone who is separating the legal from the practical, "Desmond, nothing you've described is legally problematic. Converting a garage opening to different use on your own property, with appropriate permits, is entirely within your rights. The historic review process is what it is, and you know it better than I do. And I see no reason why you wouldn't be allowed to take whatever vacation you have planned." She said vacation with a quality that told me she understood exactly what I was describing. I said, "I want it to be completely done before I leave." She said, "Then make sure your contractor has enough lead time." Chapter 6, the research. I want to tell you about the research I did before I moved forward, because the research was comprehensive, and because every element of what I did was informed by precise understanding of the applicable rules. This is, I think, the part of the story that most directly reflects the fact that I am an architect. The Crestline Park Historic District has specific design guidelines administered by the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission. Those guidelines cover exterior alterations to contributing structures, of which my garage was one, and require a certificate of appropriateness for any work that changes the exterior appearance of a historic structure. In filling a garage opening, converting a garage door opening to a solid wall is a permitted alteration under the Historic District Guidelines, subject to design review. The guidelines specifically provide that infilled garage openings should be finished in a manner consistent with the historic character of the structure. Given that my garage was already clad in the same cedar shingles as the main house and had the same exterior material palette, a properly detailed brick infill with matching trim, and a recessed panel design consistent with the craftsman aesthetic would be entirely approvable. I knew this because I had designed historic alterations in Portland before. I had reviewed the guidelines for specific projects. I was, professionally, exactly the kind of person who understood this process in detail. I submitted a Certificate of Appropriateness application to the Historic Landmarks Commission in March, 2 months before the events of June. My application included complete architectural drawings, material specifications, finished details, and a design narrative explaining how the proposed infill was consistent with the historic character of the structure. I had prepared the application myself, which is not unusual. Architects often act as their own applicants on personal projects. The Commission reviewed the application in April. They approved it in May. The Certificate of Appropriateness was issued the first week of June. I hired a masonry contractor named David Lim, who did historic restoration work in Portland and who had worked with me on a previous project. I briefed him on the scope. He told me it was 2 days of work for his crew, maybe 3 given the finish requirements for historic consistency. I told him I needed it done in 2 days. He said he could do it. I booked the flight to Japan on the same day. The Certificate of Appropriateness was approved. Chapter 7, the 8 months. I want to pause here and tell you about the 8 months. Because the story so far has been about the plan, and I want to make sure you understand the full weight of what preceded it. From October to June, 8 months, Linda Forsyth parked in my garage approximately 68 times, twice a week, with occasional absences for her own travel and schedule, 68 times. In the studio, where I draft buildings. I want to describe what it is like to be an architect and to come into your workspace and find someone else's vehicle parked in it. It is not just inconvenience. It is a particular kind of intrusion that is difficult to convey precisely, but that I will try. A studio is not just a place. A studio is the physical expression of your creative process. It is where your materials are, where your light is, where the specific quality of silence that you need for focused design work exists. Having a car in the middle of it is not like having a car in a parking space. It is like having a car in your living room. It is that wrong. I worked around it. When Linda's Lexus was in the garage, I worked in the house, which was less good but serviceable. But the 68 times added up. The documentation log added up. The 5 conversations that produced nothing added up. The HOA complaint reviewed by the person I was complaining about added up. Catherine's assessment that the legal path was available but slow added up. And every time I walked through my studio with someone else's car in it, the plan became clearer. I was not angry in the way of someone who is going to do something reckless. I was resolved in the way of someone who has been patient for the right amount of time and is now going to act with complete precision. Architects work in drawings, not emotions. The drawing was clear, the execution would be clean, and I was going to Japan. Chapter 8, the week before. The week before the Friday of the infill, I did several things in deliberate sequence. On Monday, I met with David Lim at the garage and walked him through the scope in detail. He had seen the drawings. He had seen them when I hired him because I had prepared complete construction documents, not just a sketch, because that is how architects work, but I wanted to walk the site with him one more time. He confirmed the 2-day timeline. He said his crew would start at 7 a.m. Friday and would be done by end of day Saturday, allowing for full cure time over the weekend before the mortar was exposed to weather. On Tuesday, I sent a formal written notice to Linda by certified mail and by email, informing her that I would be making a permitted alteration to my garage structure beginning on Friday, and that as a result, the garage would no longer be accessible after the work was completed. I noted the certificate of appropriateness number and the specific permit number. I told her that any vehicle in the garage would need to be removed before 7 a.m. Friday. She called me Wednesday morning. She said she had received my letter and wanted to understand what kind of alteration I was making. I told her I was infilling the garage opening as part of a studio renovation. She said that seemed extreme. I said it was a permitted and approved alteration. She said she would need her car back. I said she should retrieve it by Thursday evening. She said she would. She did not retrieve it. On Thursday evening, the Lexus was still in my garage. I photographed it at 8 p.m., timestamp documented. I texted Linda, "Your vehicle is still in my garage. Work begins at 7 tomorrow. Please remove it tonight." No response. At 6 a.m. Friday, I photographed the car again. It was still there. At 6:45, I texted Linda again, "Work beginning in 15 minutes. Your vehicle needs to be removed immediately." No response. At 7 a.m., David Lim's crew arrived with the materials. I photographed the Lexus one final time, standing next to David's truck with the timestamp visible. Then I opened the pedestrian door of the garage, stepped out, and told David to begin. David looked at me. He said, "The car." I said the car was in my garage without my permission. It's Linda Forsyth's. Her number is in the letter I wrote. I've notified her 4 times this week. I've moved my truck out. She can move hers. David had done enough work in Portland to understand complicated situations. He said, "As long as we're not interfering with her property." I said, "We're building a wall across a garage opening on my property. Her car happens to be on my property. Those are 2 separate facts." David said, "Right." He looked at his crew. He said, "Let's start with the frame." Chapter 9, the build. David's crew was 4 people, including him. They worked with the focused efficiency of a team that has done this kind of work many times and knows exactly what each step requires. I was present for the beginning, and then I left, not because I wasn't interested, but because I had a flight to catch and things to finish before I left. The first step was the framing, a pressure-treated sill plate on the existing concrete apron, vertical studs at 16-inch centers, a header size to transfer load from the existing structure above the opening. The framing went up in about 3 hours Friday morning. David called me when it was done, and I drove by on my way to some errands and looked at it from the alley. The opening was framed. The Lexus, visible through the framing, was still inside. I had arranged, through Catherine, for a city property record to confirm that the car's presence inside the structure at the time of a permitted alteration did not create any legal complication. Catherine had confirmed it did not. My property, permitted work, properly notified owner of the vehicle who had chosen not to retrieve it. The vehicle's presence was a result of the vehicle owner's choices, not mine. Friday afternoon, the masonry began. David's crew laid the first courses of brick, a Roman brick in a color I had specified to match the existing chimney brick on the main house, which the historic review had approved and which looked from a distance as if it had always been there. The brick was salvaged. David had a relationship with an architectural salvage supplier, and I had spec'd reclaimed brick to enhance the historic authenticity of the infill. By Friday evening, the wall was about 4 feet tall. The Lexus was behind it, visible above the rising brick line. I drove by at 6 p.m. on my way home. David called me as I was looking at it from the alley. He said it was going well and that they were on track for completion Saturday afternoon. I told him excellent. I told him my flight was Saturday evening and I needed the exterior finished before I left. He said he had it. I went home and packed. Chapter 10, Saturday morning. I need to tell you about Saturday morning, because Saturday morning is when Linda Forsyth understood what was happening. She called me at 9:23 a.m. I was in my kitchen making coffee with my bags already by the door. I answered. She said, "Desmond, there is a wall being built across your garage." I said, "Yes, it was in my letter on Tuesday." She said, "My car is in there." I said, "Yes, I notified you 4 times this week to retrieve it. I have time-stamped records of each notification." She said, "You can't seal my car inside your garage." I said carefully, "Linda, my car is not in the garage. Your car is in the garage because you put it there without my permission, as you have done 68 times in the past 8 months, and because you chose not to retrieve it despite 4 formal notifications this week. I am making a permitted alteration to my property. The certificate of appropriateness is filed with the Historic Landmarks Commission. The building permit is filed with the city. The work is legal and approved and in progress." She said, "This is Desmond. This is insane. How am I supposed to get my car?" Said, "You have several options. You can contact David Lim, whose number is in the materials I sent you, and ask him to pause work while you retrieve the vehicle. Or you can contact the city and ask whether you have any legal basis to halt permitted work on my property. Or you can contact your attorney and ask what remedies are available to you." I paused. What I would note is that all of those options were also available to you on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. She said, "I'm calling the HOA." I said, "You are the HOA. I've been trying to get help from the HOA for 8 months. She did not respond to that. I said, "Linda, my flight is at 6 this evening. I hope this situation resolves itself constructively." I paused. "Please contact David directly if you want to retrieve the car. His number is in my Tuesday letter." I ended the call. I finished my coffee. I loaded my bags into a car share vehicle I had arranged. I drove to the airport. Chapter 11. What happened while I was at the airport. I landed in Tokyo 14 hours after I left Portland. In the 14 hours between my departure and my landing, the following things happened, which I know from a combination of David Lim's text messages, a call from Catherine, and a very detailed message from my neighbor on the south side, a man named Harold Chen, who has lived at 26 Crestline Court for 20 years, and who had the particular perspective of someone who had watched the whole situation develop from 12 feet away, and who had strong feelings about how it was going. At approximately 11 a.m. Saturday, Linda came to the construction site and asked David to stop work so she could retrieve her car. David, who had my instructions to continue unless I personally told him to stop, called me. I did not answer because I was in the air. He called Catherine. Catherine, who was prepared for exactly this contingency, told David that the work was permitted and authorized and that he should continue, and that if Linda wanted to pursue a halt, she would need to go through the city permit office, which was closed on Saturday. David told Linda. Linda called the city permit office. The permit office was closed on Saturday. Linda called the Portland Bureau of Development Services non-emergency line. She was told that permitted work could not be halted by a third party on a weekend without a court order. Linda called her own attorney. Her attorney said the same thing. At approximately 1 p.m. Saturday, Linda drove to the alley and sat in her other car, a smaller sedan, watching David's crew work. Harold could see her from his kitchen window. He described her as sitting very still for a very long time. At approximately 4 p.m. Saturday, the wall was complete. David's crew finished the exterior face, applied the mortar pointing, and installed the cedar trim details I had specified. Harold said that when they stepped back and looked at it from the alley, it looked, in his words, like it had been there since 1931. David sent me a photograph. I received it when I landed in Tokyo. I looked at it on my phone in the arrivals hall. The photograph showed the rear of the garage, now a solid wall, brick-faced with period-appropriate trim and a recessed panel detail that matched the craftsman vocabulary of the main structure. It looked exactly as designed. It looked, honestly, better than the garage doors had looked. It was the kind of infill that preservation architects aspire to, not a solution that pretends the opening was never there, but a solution that acknowledges the history of the building while presenting a new and coherent face. Behind it was Linda Forsyth's Lexus. I put my phone in my pocket and went to find my hotel transfer. Chapter 12, The Messages. My phone received a significant volume of messages over the 14 hours of my flight that I did not read until Tokyo. I want to describe them, as I did in Arthur Penn's story, because their arc tells you something important. Linda sent 7 messages. The first 3 sent during my flight were variations on a single theme. This is unacceptable, you need to stop this, call me immediately. The 4th, sent around the time the wall was nearly complete, shifted in tone. It was more formal, citing her attorney's name and suggesting that legal action was being considered. The 5th, sent after the wall was complete, was a single sentence. My car is inside your wall. The 6th was from the following morning, Sunday, and I read this several times in Tokyo because the phrasing was remarkable. Desmond, I think we need to have an honest conversation about all of this. The 7th was from Sunday evening and asked, simply, how to get in touch with David Lim. Catherine sent 2 messages. The first confirmed that the permit work had been completed and that she had been in contact with David throughout Saturday. The second said, Desmond, the wall looks exceptional. Have a wonderful trip. Harold sent 1 message, a photograph of the finished wall from his kitchen window taken the next morning in good light, with the caption, "This is a beautiful piece of work. Enjoy Japan." I responded to Catherine and Harold. I did not respond to Linda. I went to my hotel. I changed. I went out into Tokyo in the early morning, because Tokyo in early morning is one of the best things available to a person who is willing to be awake for it. Quiet in a way that large cities almost never are, specific in its light and its sounds and its smell, completely itself in a way that I find deeply restorative after 8 months of a situation that had been the opposite of restorative. I walked for 2 hours. I ate ramen at a counter restaurant that opened at 6 a.m. I watched the city come awake. I thought about the wall, about how it looked in David's photograph, about the recessed panel detail, about the salvaged brick matching the chimney brick. I thought, that is exactly right. HOA Karen parked in my garage again, so I closed it up and took the trip of a lifetime. Part 2, full YouTube script, continuation. Main character, DSMOND Price. Open book Part 2, Japan, the Wall and the Reckoning. Chapter 13, 3 weeks in Japan. I want to tell you about Japan properly because Japan was not a backdrop to this story. Japan was the point of the story. The wall was necessary. The wall was the right response to 8 months of a situation that had not responded to anything else. But Japan was the reason. Japan was what I had always been going to do eventually when the conditions were right, and the conditions became right on the day Linda Forsyth failed to retrieve her car for the last time. I spent 3 weeks in Japan. Tokyo for the first week, which I used in the way I use cities I care about, slowly, on foot, with a notebook, paying attention. I visited the architecture. Not just the famous buildings, though those were extraordinary, but the ordinary buildings, the residential neighborhoods, the small commercial streets, the way Japanese architecture manages the relationship between the public and the private with a precision and an intentionality that I find more instructive than any formal monument. The Japanese understanding of threshold, the transition between outside and inside, between street and dwelling, is the most sophisticated I have encountered anywhere in 30 years of architectural practice. I thought about threshold a great deal in Japan, about what it means for space to be yours, about the physical and social and legal mechanisms by which a boundary is established and maintained, about the relationship between a building and the people who occupy it and the people who do not. The wall I had built across my garage opening was, in architectural terms, exactly a threshold statement, a clear, legible, unambiguous declaration of where my space began. Japanese architecture had been making those declarations for centuries with far more sophistication and beauty than I had brought to a brick infill in Portland, but the underlying principle was the same. The second week I spent in Kyoto, which is what Kyoto is for. I walked the philosopher's path in the morning light. I visited the gardens. I sat in a temple in the rain on a Tuesday afternoon and was the only person there and watched the water run off the eaves into the gravel for an hour. Third week I went to the Japanese countryside, the Noto Peninsula, which had been in the news for earthquake damage earlier in the year, and where I spent 4 days visiting the reconstruction efforts and talking with Japanese craftsmen about traditional building techniques and materials. This was, professionally, the most valuable time of the trip. I came home with notes and photographs that have already influenced 2 projects in development and that I expect to be drawing from for years. I did not think about the wall much during the trip, not because it wasn't there, it was there, and occasionally a message would come in from Catherine or Harold that reminded me of its ongoing existence. But I had built what I had built, and it was done, and the situation was in the process of resolving itself through its own logic while I was in Japan, and there was nothing I needed to do or manage. Catherine was available. Harold was watching. David Lim's wall was standing. I trusted the work, as Arthur Penn had trusted the Portugal mornings, as June Rawlings had trusted Barbara's filing while she rode the fence line with Lily, as every person in these stories who has done the right thing carefully and completely and then stepped back and allowed the consequences to unfold without their continuous management. I trusted the work, and I ate extraordinary food, and I walked through cities that had been thinking about space and threshold, and the relationship between human beings and architecture for 1,000 years, longer than Portland had existed. It was, without question, the best 3 weeks of my professional adult life. Chapter 14, What Happened in Portland. While I was in Japan, several things happened in Portland that I am going to tell you about in the order I learned of them, because the order matters. The first thing was the car. Harold texted me on Sunday evening, 2 days after I left, to say that Linda had contacted David Lim on Sunday morning, as her messages had suggested she would, and David had returned to the garage site with his crew and removed a section of the new wall, a removable panel I had specified in my drawings for exactly this purpose. The design included a framed section at the right side of the opening that was built as a removable unit, fastened rather than mortared, so that it could be detached to allow the car to exit if necessary. This was Catherine's idea originally. She had suggested that building in a retrieval path for the car eliminated the most obvious legal complication and demonstrated good faith about the car's accessibility. I had designed the panel to be indistinguishable from the permanent masonry from the outside, which it was, but fully removable from within. David detached the panel. Linda retrieved the Lexus. David reinstalled the panel, repointed the joint, and the wall was complete.